Welcome back to another episode of Living History. Last week we spoke to William Shakespeare, who mentioned how pleased he was that his play Hamlet had been adapted into The Lion King for younger audiences. Today, we will be speaking to the man who made that possible. Walt Disney was an American animator, film producer, and the winner of more Oscars than any other person with 22. His film studio has captured hearts across generations with timeless classics like Beauty and the Beast, Peter Pan, Toy Story, Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, and Cinderella. He is beloved by kids around the world for giving their childhood a sense of magic and for his theme parks Disneyland and Disney World. Many of the things you will hear from Mr. Disney today are direct quotes. This guest was easier than most to get on the show because he could come straight from his cryogenic freezing chamber, of course. Please welcome Walt Disney. Mr. Disney, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Casey.
Of course. Mr. Disney, you are one of the most famous men of the last 100 years. Your work is beloved by all ages. I wanted to start by asking how you got here. What was your childhood like, and what led you to create this empire of storytelling?
Well, sure. Well, I'll start by explaining that my family didn't have a lot of money growing up. My dad, he ran a newspaper company, and he was the kind of guy who would save every penny that he could get. So instead of hiring workers, he would have me and my brother come and deliver newspapers after school, before school. He was the kind of guy who didn't believe in new shoes until your shoes had completely worn out. Well, when I wasn't delivering newspapers, I would spend, you have to understand, all my free time drawing and doodling. And to put it mildly, my father, Elias Disney, did not approve. He thought it was impractical, and he was not at all supportive of me wanting to be an artist. And maybe he was right. But in fact, my father was so adamant about not purchasing me any art supplies, I had to use our toilet paper. My dad would get very angry, and there was never a problem that he thought couldn't be cured with us boys without a belt. And I just remember I would always think, how could that cruel old man be my father? And more importantly, why my mom wouldn't do anything when he would hurt us. I wanted to get out of there, and I saw my chance in the Army. So even though I was 16, I faked my age and applied, but I was rejected for being too short.
How ironic, since Disney roller coasters would become notorious for turning away kids for being too short. I can remember that all too well. But I do know how when your dad died a few decades later, you skipped his funeral. In fact, one of your biographers described you as the product of your difficult childhood, as the emotionally driven son of a cold father who sought to create a fantasy world for himself in which he would feel loved and safe, and ended up spreading that invention to the world, similar to Robin Williams. How did your father react to your eventual artistic success?
Well, people can think whatever they want. He was still reserved as my fame grew, but eventually he seemed to be proud of me. But that's neither here nor there. When I was rejected from the Army, I went on to my plan B. I joined the Red Cross, and I would just not stop drawing. I would fill the ambulances with caricatures of my other paramedics, one of whom was McDonald's businessman Ray Kroc. And when I got back, Casey, I was ecstatic to learn I'd won a scholarship to study at the Kansas City Art Institute. When I was there, I would draw all day, and then I would go to the movie theater where there would be primitive animated cartoons before the main feature of the film, and I was amazed. So when I was 19, my friend Abba Works and we started our own animation company, the Laugh-O-Gram Studio. The company failed after 3 years, but some of our cartoons that would play before features at the movie theater did pretty well, and that's when I first experimented with what would later become Disney staples, animated animal characters and slapstick humor, remaking some of the old fairy tale classics. Some of the slapstick humor came from the imitations I would do of my idol Charlie Chaplin when I was a kid. But Casey, I saw your last episode with Mr. Shakespeare. It seemed like he was a shrewd businessman. Regrettably, I did not share his business acumen. You see, Works in my studio was contracted for a number of cartoons to be paid the equivalent of $150,000 today, but we were never paid. And that could have been the end for us. But I always advise, when you believe in a thing, believe in it all the way, implicitly and unquestionably. So with the money we did have, Works and I went to California and were commissioned by a distributor to realize my vision of a mix of animation and live action shorts, long before Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But animation was really expensive at that time, you see, and we had to hand draw 24 frames per second. And in order to get the job, we had to work more hours for less pay. I think you'll find this interesting. There are a number of economists today who argue that a minimum wage hurts minorities because when they face discrimination, they cannot get out of it through lower rates of pay. The employer would not face any cost for discriminating. Well, that was sort of the situation we were in. We ended up, because we had to pay so low, we hired all women to be animators for our business. With the help of my brother Roy, who had joined me. He had a much better business mind than I did. You see, we had such a small operation that I ran a carpool to drop off some of our employees every day at the end of the day. But, well, the truth is there was one employee named Lilian Bounds who, well, no matter how close we were to her house, I would always make sure I dropped her off last. We were married in 1925. How romantic. So, is this when your career as an animator began to take off? You might say, yes, but not in the way I wanted. This was when I created my first major character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and he was a hit. In those days, after we finally made Oswald, we had a bit of money. And I wanted to become independent with my own studio. But remember what I mentioned earlier about being a poor businessman? The aforementioned distributor I worked for snuck into my contract that they would own every character I produce. That's right. Before Taylor Swift and Scooter Braun, there was Walt Disney and Oswald the Not-So-Lucky Rabbit. And it gets worse. I took the blame for the poor working conditions that the studio made me impose on all my workers. And so, because of that, all my employees quit working for me. And listen to this, they were then hired en masse by the very company that had forced me to burden them. Oh, Casey, I was so depressed, I'd lost everything. On the train back to my wife, I doodled a little character called Mortimer Mouse. My wife said she preferred the name Mickey. Wow, so that's how Mickey Mouse was created. That's the story. After all my employees quit, it was just my brother and I and our wives and my loyal friend, Works. We didn't have a lot of bandwidth for failure with this new character, Mickey Mouse. So we all gathered and tried to make him into a cartoon, and it failed. We tried again, and nobody wanted it. Then finally, I thought about the movies I'd been watching that so captivated my imagination at that moment. And this new innovation I had briefly seen on the big screen, synchronized sound. Well, it had never been done with a cartoon before. I took Mickey Mouse and I placed him on a steamboat, and I had him whistle, along with a soundtrack that matched his lips so it looked like the cartoon himself was whistling, and you could hear it. Audiences were stunned. We got standing ovations in the movie theater. And we had finally made it. In 1933, we created a short called The Three Little Pigs that was so successful, theaters started placing it above the main feature on the marquee as a draw for audiences. That film had a song called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf that became a popular anthem during the depths of the Great Depression. It was the source for the name of that famous Edward Albee play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and, well, it was beloved by figures as diverse as Adolf Hitler, who was reported to frequently whistle it, and LL Cool J, who I've recently learned about coming to this modern world, who released his own popular cover of the song. Fancy that. And despite my company's increasing lobby to extend copyright law, this song is now in the public domain, so why don't we show a little bit from it today?
He don't take no time to play, time to play, time to play. All he does is work all day.
You can play and laugh and fiddle. Don't think you can make me sore. I'll be safe and you'll be sorry when the wolf comes to your door.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf.
Yeah, that brings back memories. But sadly, not everything was going well for me at this time. My wife was a couple years older than I was, and she suffered a number of miscarriages that just destroyed me. We finally had one daughter and adopted one more. My new family and the success of my short cartoons was what made me think it was possible to dream bigger. To do a full-length animated feature, someone no one had ever heard of, let alone done. Well, I got to work on making it happen in 1934, and no one believed it was possible. Disney's folly, they called it. But I think it's kind of fun to do the impossible. And in 1937, after 4 years of intense labor, we completed our full-length feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. But on opening night, I could hardly have been more nervous. You see, Casey, I didn't know whether audiences could connect emotionally to a drawing. That was what worried me so much when the picture first came on the screen. Then the picture started, and everyone was silent. I thought, is this the end of my career? Will I have to go back to making shorts? But then we got to the part where Snow White eats the apple. And I heard audible weeps from the crowd. I can still remember it now. That moment was something special. That's when I knew we had made something special. Wow, what a story. To this day, adjusted for inflation, it is still the highest-growing animated film ever made. And after that, you earned not only a special Oscar for significant screen innovation, but they even presented it with 7 little statuettes. Yeah, I thought, you see, I don't make pictures just to make money. I make money to make pictures. And on the momentum of Snow White, I went ahead with 2 more feature lengths in 1940. Pinocchio did well, but sadly, despite all we put into it, audiences didn't respond as well to Fantasia. So for our next feature, Dumbo, we had to cut the budget and the runtime. To be honest with you, if you watch Dumbo today, you can see the animation is a bit more crude. It's not as long as my previous couple movies. But also, we had to cut down our efforts because there was a strike from my animators. Now, Casey, I understand on this program you had one Karl Marx. Well, I'll tell you now, I have no time for him or for communists of any kind. Marx, Stalin, Castro, or domestic communists especially. They're un-American. And I was not happy when communists infiltrated my workers and caused them to strike. You're sure it was communists who made them strike? Well, it proved itself so with time. And I definitely felt it was a communist group taking over my artists. And they did take them over. They smeared me because I wouldn't go along with what they say, with their way of operating. I insisted on their strike going through the National Labor Relations Board. And the strike leader told me outright that he used them as it suited his purposes. The thing I resent the most is that they were able to get into these unions, take them over, and represent to the world that a group of people that are in my plant, that I know are good, 100% Americans are trapped by this group. And they are represented to the world as supporting all of those ideologies. And it is not so. And I feel that they really ought to be smoked out and shown up for what they are. So that all of the good, free causes in this country, all the liberalisms that really are American, can go on without the taint of communism. Wow, and is this about the time you became friends with J. Edgar Hoover to root out communists in the film industry? Well, friends might be a little strong, but yes, I testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, who did some good work, although it might have gotten a little ahead of itself in the end, to help root out the communists. Because most of the industry, you have to understand, was made of good, hard-working, patriotic Americans. Well, that testify earned me Hoover's goodwill and allowed me to film at the FBI headquarters, and I allowed him approval on how the FBI was portrayed in my movies. Very interesting. And while, Mr. Disney, I don't doubt your sincerity in fighting the communist threat in your organization, which there indeed were, especially in the American labor movement, but whose presence was exaggerated by right-wing leaders, I do think it is important to note that a part of the cause for your workers' discontent may have been that you could be a rather difficult boss. Like on your 35th birthday, your brother organized your employees to give you a surprise party. Two of them thought it would be funny to make a sexual cartoon of Mickey and Minnie Mouse to amuse you. Not my first choice of a joke either, but when you saw it, you feigned some laughter and asked who made the cartoon. Expecting a hearty congratulation, the two men responsible stepped forward and you fired them on the spot in front of everybody. That was an inappropriate cartoon. Did you want me to make them a milkshake? Well, it seems it was part of a larger habit of you humiliating employees when they didn't meet your expectations. When they did impress you, you would merely sanction their efforts with, "That'll work." And when your brother Roy, who had worked with you for so many years on the business side, tried voicing his ideas for Fantasia's soundtrack, you made him leave, telling him, "Go back and keep the books." That was not his department. And I know you had a disdain for communists and left-wingers in general. It is probably not good, though, that you had to be physically restrained from attacking the leader of the 1941 animators' strike. All right, what is this? Sure, I'm not perfect by what you would consider today. That's okay, Mr. Disney. Neither is John F. Kennedy, William Shakespeare, definitely not Karl Marx, as I'm sure you'd agree. But on Living History, we try to give the full scope of a person's life, good, bad, and in between. Now, as your success was growing at this time, is it true you felt a separation, a hollowness from your public image? Yes, I did. It felt like I wasn't Walt Disney anymore, the boy who grew up in Missouri. That Walt Disney was this thing, this commodity. And you would work all the time, sometimes 14 hours a day. Very far from the work ethic of Mr. Marx. Well, that's because I was no damn communist. Of course, Mr. Disney. But we still haven't even mentioned one of your most famous and renowned projects, Disneyland. I was just there a few days ago. Yes, of course. I spent the last decade of my life on that project. Just like with Snow White, nobody thought it could be done. But like I say, it's kind of fun to do the impossible. Disneyland is the result of love. We did not go into Disneyland to make money. And after years of planning and building, the long-awaited opening of the park was set for July 17, 1955, with, in fact, Ronald Reagan as one of our opening announcers, who I've recently learned became the American president. Wow. But the truth is the day was a disaster. I long after called it Black Sunday. We expected 15,000 guests and we got 30. Restaurants ran out of food. The temperature was 101 degrees. A gas leak shut down parts of the park. One ride had so many overgrown weeds, I just had our staff place Latin names on them so people would think they were exotic plant species. I guess I can come clean about that now. Guest shoes had been sticking to the asphalt that had been poured the previous day. Oh yeah, lines were so long that a couple parents actually threw their children over the crowds, which I did not recommend. And if these commies hadn't caused me enough trouble, there was a plumber's strike that made me choose between working toilets and working water fountains. I think you can guess which we went with. I think I can too, but on the upside for guests back then is that tickets today for Disneyland range from $100 to $200.
On opening day, even adjusting for inflation, mind you, tickets were $12 and $6 for kids. I can't believe how expensive tickets have become. We never went into Disneyland to make money. It was a dream. It was a place of joy, the happiest place on earth. Well, I know you don't express a lot of positive praise when things go well, but Mr. Disney, you should be very proud of what you've created. Disneyland and Disney World, along with Disneylands in China, Japan, and France, attract hundreds of thousands of guests every day and tens of millions every year. Wow, that's something. It certainly is. Now, some celebrities feel they have married stage wives or gold diggers, but you didn't have that with Lilian. No, in fact, she had very little interest in the Hollywood social scene, and she was content to support me and manage our household. Though sometimes she could be insubordinate, and I would sometimes complain to my friends how henpecked I was. I would deal with stress smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, but it wasn't usually because of my wife. Oftentimes, it was my mother. Your mother? Would she tell you what to do or be mad at you? She was strict, but she was wonderful. And I killed her. You killed her? Yeah. I bought her a house when I finally made it big, and the furnace system had some issues, so I sent some of my workers to fix it. I should have made sure they did a thorough job. My mom died from carbon monoxide poisoning from that house shortly after. I could never forgive myself. I should never forgive myself. I'm so sorry to hear that. That reminds me of when John F. Kennedy told us about the guilt he felt about his sister's lobotomy, but this directly involves you. I'm so sorry. You can imagine that I kept smoking after that. And, sadly, in 1966, I was diagnosed with lung cancer, and it killed me within a few months. I'm so sorry. Yeah, well, I would still choose to be happy when I could, you know? I mean, happiness is a state of mind. You can be happy and you can be unhappy just according to the way you look at things. Happiness is contentment, but it doesn't mean you have to have wealth. All individuals are different. Some wouldn't be satisfied carrying out a routine job and being happy. Yet I envy those people. I had a brother who I really envied because he was a mailman, but he had all the fun. He had himself a trailer, and he used to go out and go fishing. And he didn't worry about payrolls or stories or picture grosses or anything. And he was the happy one. I always said, he was a smart businessman. Yeah, you definitely accomplished great things, but seems like you had a stressful life. Yeah, when you're curious, you find lots of interesting things to do. But always remember, this whole thing was started with a dream and a mouse. Well, Mr. Disney, now I turn it over to you. What would you like to say to our listeners, all of whose lives have been touched by you and your work? Well, I'll remind them that if they have a dream, the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. Talk is cheap. It means nothing until you do the work. Thank you, Mr. Walt Disney. This episode was made possible thanks to our generous patrons. If you'd like to be a part of the mission we have here to bring podcast guests that aren't just today's celebrities, but people from all of history, the same way you would see them talk on an interview show today, to really know not only about them, but who they were, what they believed, and get a sense of their personality, please join us on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching Living History.